And so it will give you a notification that we'll be recording. And we're recording. And so we will begin. So welcome to the COVID Clarity series, which is an ongoing business navigation and education series on relevant topics impacting our daily lives as we deal with the challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. This series is sponsored by the Seoul District Business Association, Sussman and Shank Attorneys, LLP, and will be moderated by Flossin Media. I'm your host, Stephen Christian, and I'll be taking you through this series of sessions. Today's presentation and each presentation, to follow throughout the next month will be led by business experts in their industry who will discuss relevant topics, answer questions in the chat, and engage public comments and discussions through a live Zoom platform like the one that we're in right now. Today's topic will be on the state's foreclosure and eviction moratorium. Our expert presenter today, Bryson Davis, is an attorney at Sussman Shank, LLP, and Bryson regularly serves a wide-ranging legal needs of businesses and nonprofits of all sizes and industries. Bryson's practice involves advising and representing for-profit and nonprofit clients in a broad range of business issues, from formation to sale, and he often serves as external general counsel for his clients. His practice touches on mergers and acquisitions, business formation and maintenance, securities, offerings and sales, real estate transactions, contract drafting, employment advice, and regulatory compliance. Man, that's a lot of stuff, a lot of stuff under that umbrella. And in addition, he has specialized knowledge helping clients in the cannabis industry, working with professional licensing issues, and handling administrative law matters. In addition to his legal practice, Bryson is committed to improving social and economic equity across the Northwest BIPOC communities. The commitment has led to Bryson's participation and leadership within several nonprofit organizations and community groups whose mission and purpose is focused on increasing equity, supporting diverse representation, and community economic development. When not working, Bryson can be found working on one of his cars or his racing card, or playing tabletop and board games with friends. And I really like the board game part because, I'm getting into the board games because of COVID, and, man, I didn't realize how robust that community is. And so with that, we have Bryson Davis with us, and, thanks for joining us, and you have the floor. It looks like you are not, your mic is not connected right now. Looks like we can't hear you right now.
Is this better? There we go.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Must have been something wrong with my headphones. So today I'm going to talk about the status of the eviction moratorium. If you have any questions about the foreclosure moratorium, you can feel free to email me, but I'm not really going to cover that today. And one of the things that I think is helpful and why I chose to do this topic is to bring some clarity to the various different moratoriums that are out there, which have different end dates, some from the Fed, some from the state, some from the county. And so you can get your head around the timelines and the requirement for each one. So let me.
Okay. So we're doing the eviction, and if people want to learn more about the foreclosure, then they can reach out to you, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some resources for that we could point people to.
Yeah, my email is it's going to be on the last slide if people don't already have it.
Okay. Yeah, definitely.
All right. So a little bit of history around the eviction moratorium. Everything sort of started with the Executive Order 2003 that was issued by the governor at the beginning of the pandemic crisis. This provides the basis for all of her executive orders going forward, because the eviction moratoriums that were based on executive orders require a state of emergency to have authority. And so this gives that authority for those future executive orders. Multnomah County followed up before the state put in an eviction moratorium and passed a local moratorium that had some additional rules that weren't in the state moratorium, that were then dropped later. Oregon came up with an all-encompassing eviction moratorium covering residential and commercial tenants through Executive Order 2013. And that was passed in April and then extended through House Bill 4013. And that covers all tenants cannot be evicted by their landlord for non-payment or for no cause. The county commissioners also passed Ordinance 1284 at that point to have the county requirements conform with the state. And it got rid of some of the extra rules that were in Executive Rule 388 that weren't required under the state rule. The CDC, the federal agency, also issued an order to halt residential evictions through December 31st of 2020. But we won't get too much into that one because you'll see later it's not really going to affect Oregon residents very much. So where are we now? So right now the CDC order is still in place. The state residential eviction moratorium was extended. So Executive Order 2056 extended the residential eviction moratorium until December 31st of this year. It did not extend the commercial eviction moratorium. The commercial eviction moratorium expired September 30th of this year. So how does the moratorium work? What does it encompass? What are the requirements, that sort of thing? So the eviction moratorium structure under the House bill, which lasted until September 30th, was for it was for residential and commercial tenants, and it covered the following reasons. It covered for non-payment of rents and for no-cause evictions. So if you weren't paying your rent, your landlord couldn't evict you, and your landlord couldn't evict you for the several reasons listed in the statutes that are considered no-cause evictions, such as not wanting to renew the term of a lease and that kind of thing. Landlords had restrictions built into what they could do, in addition to tenants having the ability to not be evicted. There were lots of restrictions that prevented landlords from engaging in tactics that misled tenants. So for instance, you couldn't send notices to tenants that they were being evicted or that their lease was being terminated. You couldn't file any actions that were prohibited under the moratorium. And then also late fees for the various payments that tenants weren't able to pay during the moratorium. Late fees were waived, so you couldn't, as a landlord, charge late fees for those payments that tenants weren't able to make. Though evictions were under a moratorium under the bill, the unpaid payments are still due eventually. So any missed payments are due at the end of a 6-month grace period after that September 30th date, which ends March 31st, 2021. So if you weren't paying rent in the time during the moratorium, you're gonna have to make all of that payment up by March 31st of next year. And again, no late charges on those payments can be charged by the landlords. So under Executive Order 2056, which extended this past the September 30th date, it only applies to residential tenants. It's for the same reasons, for the non-payment of rent, for no-cause evictions, and otherwise substantially the same as as House Bill 4213. But as I mentioned, the commercial tenants aren't included in the extension. It only applies to residential tenants. And then the Multnomah Ordinance 1287 extended the county eviction moratorium. It's a little bit different than the state, but only insofar as instead of ending on December 31st, it ends on January 8th. And it is also only for residential tenants. It does not cover commercial tenants. So what does non-payment mean? Eviction for non-payment. So here we're talking about all sorts of regular payments that you normally make under your lease. So rent, late charges, utility charges, service charges, and any other charges, fees that came due while the moratorium was in place. The payments that are included in non-payments only apply to the moratorium timeline. So if you are a commercial tenant, you can only be evicted for non-payment for payments made up until September 30th. If you are a residential tenant, it's December 31st for most of the state and January 8th for Multnomah County residents. So no cause, what's the no cause eviction? This is something that's terminated by the landlord not for a reason for the tenant violating the lease or the tenant terminating the lease wanting to move someplace else. This often includes the term ends and you're not extending it, you raising the rent more than the threshold amount, and it applies to month, as well as term tenancies. So if you have a month-to-month tenancy and you're not willing to renew it for the next month, for whatever reason, then that's going to be a no cause eviction, and that's not something that you can do while the moratorium is in place. So do tenants still owe rent? And the answer is, the short answer is yes. You still owe your landlord rent. The rent can just be paid later than it was normally due. So your rent in June, for instance, if for some reason May didn't go so well for you and you needed to delay your June rent payment, you can pay your June rent payment as late as the end of the grace period. Again, there's no interest or penalties for paying it later, as long as you pay it before the end of the grace period. Now, when the moratorium ends, all payments that come due after the end of the moratorium are due on the normal date. So for commercial tenants, the moratorium ended on September 30th. So the rent for October, if it was due October 1st, was due October 1st and had to be paid on October 1st. Now, advice we normally give to clients, both residential and commercial tenants is if you can pay the rent, to pay the rent. That will keep you from ending up with a big ballooning amount that you owe at the end of the grace period. And a lot of landlords are extra happy, and you can improve your relationship with your landlord just by doing what you normally would do and normally can do. So if you can pay the rent, we definitely recommend that you do pay the rent, even though under the moratorium you don't have to until the end of the grace period. So other evictions. Obviously, there are other ways that you could be evicted rather than just the non-payment of rent. You could be destroying the space. You could cause other problems. You could violate other terms of the lease. You could try to assign the lease when you're not allowed to assign the lease. If you're in a residential area, you could be violating the rules of inhabiting the space. You can still be evicted for all of those reasons, the four cause reasons, during the moratorium. So just because the moratorium's in place, it's only in place for the tenant not being able to pay their rent. It's not in place for all reasons under the sun. So briefly touch on the CDC order. So the Center for Disease Control, which is the federal agency that is in charge of infectious diseases and research and things like that. They issued a public health administrative rule that currently matches with the state's extension timeline. So the CDC order puts in place a moratorium on residential evictions through December 31st, 2020 for the non-payment of rent. It does not apply to commercial evictions, so commercial tenants aren't saved under the CDC order either for paying rent this fall. And in Oregon, it doesn't really help Oregon tenants very much because state law and county law, the state and county ordinances that put in place our eviction moratoriums provide fewer restrictions and make it easier for tenants to get the benefits of the eviction moratorium than the CDC order. And so the CDC order is largely irrelevant for Oregon residents at this point. So current status of the state moratorium, it's been extended until December 31st. Grace period still remains the same of March 30th. The grace period was not extended with the rest of the moratorium, and applies to residential tenants. For commercial tenants, moratoriums ended. If your rent was due on the 1st of October, it was due on the 1st of October. You still have until March 31st to pay any of the missed payments from April through September. If you don't pay your rent that's due now, you don't pay your October rent, or you don't pay your November rent, or you don't pay your December rent, you can be evicted as normal. That being said, as a practical matter, if the volume is high enough, there may be court delays and problems getting things through. It's a little too soon to see if that's going to be an issue, but that's a consideration, as courts they're not operating at full capacity given all their COVID restrictions. Current status of Multnomah County, again, for residential tenants, it's been extended, and it's been extended to January 8th of next year, 2021. And one of the benefits of this for Multnomah County residents is if your January rent is due on January 1st, that is covered under the moratorium. And Multnomah County also extended the grace period an extra 6 months. And so the grace period for Multnomah County residents is June 8th of 2021. So your January rent isn't, you can't be evicted for not paying your January rent in Multnomah County until June of next year. The commercial tenants, it's the same as with the state. The moratorium ended, and the grace period is still 6 months from the end of the moratorium, which is March. So what should you do going forward? So if you're a residential tenant, again, if you can pay rent, we recommend that you pay rent. The Executive Order 2056 extended the state moratorium if you're outside of Multnomah County to December 31st, but did not extend the grace period. The grace period is still March 31st under the state moratorium. Ordinance 1287 did extend the grace period for those in Multnomah County, and the new end of the moratorium is January 8th. So if you're in the county, it's not till January 8th, and the grace period is extended to 6 months after January 8th, which actually is July 8th of 2021. The other thing, as a residential tenant, though you're still under the moratorium, make sure you're not violating any other terms of your lease, because you can still be evicted for violating other terms of your lease. For commercial tenants, you really have to treat this like we're back to normal. You pay rent like you normally pay under your lease, and if you have rent that wasn't paid under the moratorium, and you can start making payments to that, we definitely recommend that you start making payments to that again, so you don't have a big balloon payment at the end of the grace period. You're kind of paying it off as you go. That being said, again, the rent that you didn't pay under the moratorium won't be due until the end of the grace period at the end of March. So what if, as a commercial tenant, you've got concerns that you won't be able to pay the rent that you got delayed under the moratorium before the end of the grace period? And so one thing that we recommend that commercial tenants do is come up with a realistic plan, realistic business plan to determine where you're going to get the money to pay those payments eventually, and come up with a timeline of when you realistically can do that. And then talk to your landlord to see if you can come to some agreement to extend the payments over time, or delay your payments until after things are starting to be a little bit more open and commercial tenants are able to operate at full capacity. Being in contact with your landlord and keeping them apprised of your situation can be very helpful to landlords being lenient. One quick way for landlords to just assume the worst is if they don't hear from you. And so if you're in a spot where you're thinking, I'm not going to be able to make everything, the full payment back by the end of the grace period, most landlords will consider working with you and will help you mend stuff, as long as you have a realistic plan for how you're gonna make those payments. Now, if you can't make your current payments that are due, again, talk to your landlord about your situation, about what is reasonable and workable for your business to get everything back on track. I would not expect landlords to forgive that much rent. They don't have an obligation to, and currently we're not in a situation with huge mass evictions and in and mass vacancies in lots of areas. So they're probably going to be reluctant to forgive rent, but many are so that they don't end up with issues in empty vacant space. Many are working with their tenants to adjust the timeline for payment in a manner that matches well with the restrictions that are on the tenant's revenue stream. So some tips for talking to your landlord to get some of these changes made and some of these extensions in. If you're struggling to make payments for the grace period, or you're struggling to make payments that are due now. Again, before you talk with your landlord, come up with a realistic business plan and projections so that the landlord knows that you're serious about paying them back and you've got a well thought out plan for how your business going forward will eventually generate the revenue to be able to make the payments. Any changes, and I can't stress this enough, any changes that you agree to with the landlord regarding your payment timeline, regarding any of the lease terms, you want to get that in writing. Most leases require a writing to amend the lease, and the statute of frauds requires a writing for leases that affect real estate for more than a year. So all of the changes that you get, all the agreements that you come to with the landlord, if you come to it orally, if you come to it on the phone discussion, you need to get those changes in writing and signed by both parties. Now, if you're going through and you're going through your business projections, and you, after a realistic evaluation of your current position, you don't really see how your business is going to be able to go forward. You think the business is effectively done. Then you might, instead of working out with the landlord a payment plan, you might discuss with the landlord a way to terminate the lease early. Some landlords have been forgiving so that they can flip the space quickly, and most landlords in most situations are happier to come to some agreed upon arrangement as opposed to have to deal with all of the hassle of flipping a space that they didn't know beforehand was going to come vacant, and then going through the actions of collecting any extra payments due by the tenant. So discussing with the landlord beforehand can often get you more favorable terms than if you just vacate the space. Now, anytime you discuss the changes to your landlord and you're discussing your position, make sure to account for your potential personal exposure and your business asset exposure that are created by the lease and created by any guarantees of the lease. So if you just vacate the space because you don't have the revenue to pay the rent, but you have business assets, those assets could be jeopardized by any collection action. Further, if you, especially, and this is the case for a lot of first-time commercial lessees, if you guarantee your lease, you personally guarantee your lease, keep in mind that you still have that exposure if the guarantors still have that exposure if the tenant is unable to make payments. Also, there are a few types of leases that have anticipatory breach built in to the terms of the lease. And this is if you indicate to the landlord that you will breach in the future, the landlord can put you in default before you've actually breached. And if you have one of those clauses in your lease, you're going to want to make sure that you're not when you're having those discussions with your landlord for how you modify the lease going forward, you're not indicating that you definitely will breach. You're indicating that it's a possibility, and that you're trying to work with them to make it so that doesn't happen going forward. And then any strategies you have, I always recommend discussing them with an attorney, even if you just have an hour conversation and you don't retain them to do any negotiation. Often pitching your negotiation strategy to somebody who's done it can help you get a good feel for whether or not your proposal is likely to be taken seriously, what your options are under the lease, make sure you don't miss any important clauses and that kind of thing. So if you happen to be a residential landlord, I mean, right now you've just kind of got to suck it up. The current public interest of not having people be homeless while there's economic uncertainty and there's a very contagious disease is going to make both the county, the state, and the federal government reluctant to allow evictions of residential tenants before we've gotten a handle on things more fully. You also, as a residential landlord, want to make sure you're not violating any of the restrictions. You don't want to be pressuring your tenants who aren't paying legally under the moratorium. You don't want to be pressuring them into paying, or doing anything shady, such as sending them a notice telling them that they will be evicted if they don't pay. Because if you violate the moratoriums, the penalties are fairly steep. You may end up having to pay up to 3 months of the rent back to the tenant for violations. Another thing as a residential landlord is that you have to, as you get payments after the moratorium ends, you have to apply those payments first to the current period before you apply them to the amounts that were delayed due to the moratorium. So if you're a residential landlord and your tenant has a $1,000 rent payment due in the grace period, and they pay you $1,500 to cover that and cover $500 that they missed previously, but they have maybe $5,000 that was still outstanding from the moratorium, you can't apply that $1,500 to the $5,000 that was due and then say that they missed their $1,000 current payment and then evict them for that. You've got to apply the amount that they pay to the amount that's immediately due. And then again, as I mentioned on the residential tenants section, you still, as a residential landlord, have the ability to evict tenants for violating other parts of the lease. Now, for commercial landlords, really you're gonna want to take things case by case, and there's lots of considerations that you're going to have when you're deciding what to do about tenants that are struggling to make payments. Again, as of right now, if your tenants aren't making payments that are currently due, you do have your normal ability to evict them. That being said, given the current restrictions and given potential difficulties in getting new tenants, I mean, the amount of people right now who are out looking for new places or to upgrade, is much smaller than it was pre-pandemic. And so you may, when you're doing the business evaluation, it may be advantageous to you to provide your tenants a little bit of leeway so that you have at least somebody occupying the space and somebody paying at least some of the rent. Consider creative ways you can modify other terms of the lease more in your favor in exchange for extending payment deadlines past when they're due under the moratoriums. You can create a payment plan that's a little bit longer. Once the grace period's over, you can start charging interest on the late payments. So consider all of those tools when you're thinking about, all right, how do I deal with tenants who are running into issues. Another thing to consider as a landlord is evictions are likely to be a little bit slower given the speed of the court, and non-eviction civil lawsuits. So things that aren't in FED court, things that, suing a tenant for various payments are going to be much slower. We've already seen there was a backup in the courts and while the civil side of the court was closed for the first several months of the pandemic. And then when the courts reopened, they didn't reopen to full capacity because they put in a lot of pandemic-related restrictions. And so all the civil lawsuits are going much slower and progressing much more slowly. And often, especially for cases outside of small claims court, the ability to get your lawsuit through and completed in a timely manner is going to be reduced. And so consider those timelines when you're thinking about whether or not to be lenient with your terms with your tenants. All right. Now, do we have any questions, Stephen?
Yeah, so we did have one. I think you did touch on it, but I'll read it from the chat. It's what type of communication do you recommend tenants have with their landlords if you can't pay the rent or can only pay partial rent?
Yeah, and so let me readdress this, and I'll also kind of, because I talked about it on the commercial side, but also talk about it on the residential side. It's always good to, when you're struggling, even outside of the pandemic, to be in contact with your landlord to let them know what your situation is. If you're communicating with your landlord knows what's going on. Your landlord's going to be better able to plan, and they're not just going to be sitting there in the dark. And so just the act of you talking to them and letting them know what your struggle is and what your plan is to get things done can be really helpful in terms of you building a relationship with your landlord, and then also being able to get more lenient terms from your landlord. Again, though, if you are struggling to make rent or make payments that are due now, or if we get to the end of the grace period and you don't think you're going to be able to make the payment when it's due at the end of the grace period, and so under your lease you might be facing eviction or something like that, I recommend before you go to your landlord, coming up with that plan of how you're going to be able to make those payments throughout the term of your lease. That way the landlord isn't just giving you an accommodation out of the goodness of his heart. He's giving you the accommodation because he's got confidence in knowing that you are trying to make your rent payments, and knowing that you've got a reasonable plan for how you're going to make that happen. Now, for payments that are delayed under the moratorium, you don't have to be making those right now. They're delayed until the end of the grace period. But if you can make partial payments on those during the moratorium or before the end of the grace period, definitely recommend that you do that. That way you don't have to pay it all at once at the end.
Okay, yeah, that definitely clears it up, because I think when people hear moratorium and that like rent isn't due, they don't realize that at the end of the grace period, all of it is due and not just a portion. And I think that's a common misconception that I've heard frequently just among friend groups and stuff like that. And so that definitely clears it up.
Yeah, absolutely. You still owe rent. It's just when you have to pay it is delayed.
Okay. And so currently, for those that aren't rent payers, but actually like homeowners and stuff, currently, are there any banks or mortgage companies doing any types of moratoriums on payments as well?
Well, so that's where the foreclosure moratorium comes in, and it operates similar to the eviction moratorium in that you can't bring a foreclosure action for non-payment of your mortgage, and that's got its own parameters around it. But it's the same idea to prevent if you took out a loan for your house and the person in your ADU that you're leasing out to isn't making rent, and therefore you aren't able to make your mortgage payment, that kind of transfers on to your mortgage lender as well.
Okay. And I guess another one is because of all there's a lot of current protests happening in our state are starting to focus on rent moratoriums. How would you speak to those protesting on this subject? So I guess it's the question is circulating around protest focused on the rent moratorium opposed to sort of like a grander national protest. It's more specifically to the rent moratorium. So could you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to consider is on the residential side, the moratorium is still in place, and so you still can't be evicted for non-payment or for no cause in Multnomah County until January 8th, or in the rest of Oregon until December 31st. And so if you're protesting things around rent payment during this period, you want to make sure that your protest demands take into account the current restrictions. So you're not protesting people who are being evicted for non-payment now, because there is nobody who's legally being not evicted for non-payment at the current moment. I think if you are still upset about the current policy, think it should be more lenient, then your message should be focused on how can it be made more lenient, how can it better take into account people's situations. Maybe you might push for a longer grace period. Certainly, given that the moratorium was extended, extending the grace period another few months is more than reasonable, and a little surprising that it wasn't done. And then I think there's the angle of, instead of coming at it from the residential side, because I think governments really do have a lot of public health incentive to not have a lot of residential evictions because of the COVID risk. But on the commercial side, I mean, it's the small businesses and that are going to be hit the most by the lifting of the moratorium. The larger businesses still often have revenue streams or still have some rainy day or further up the company food chain supports to start making those payments again. And so focusing the protests on giving support for those small businesses to make those rent payments, maybe even future grant programs to cover those rent payments would be an area that I would focus on if I was trying to push for change in the current policies.
Okay. Okay, and so at this point, I think we will move on to the section where we open up the floor for anybody that's in the chat or anybody that's participating on the in the participation pool, and we could just make sure if you have a question or if you have a comment, unmute yourself, and then feel free to have the floor.
I have a question. Could you hear me?
Yes, so we could hear you. Yeah.
Okay. It seemed like for the commercial side of things, it's kind of like I don't see too much protection for the landlord here. During the moratorium and the orders and all that, I don't see that much protection for them as far as they have to make payments also. Okay, they got debt, they got bills too. So I don't see nothing on that side that help protect them to stay afloat. But I just wonder, is all this information available that he showed? Could we get a copy of that?
So yes, if you provide Fawn your email, she's got a copy of my PowerPoint and she's got a copy of all of the different rules, the executive orders, the ordinances, and the House bill that you can look over too. In regards to your point about protection on commercial landlords, there isn't much protection, especially specifically in the eviction moratorium. There's not a lot of protection for the landlords who do still have to make those payments. Where landlords do get some protection was in the foreclosure moratorium, where at least for the foreclosure payments, those had a moratorium on them. That being said, there are other payments that landlords run into that they have to make. Those are not covered in either. So if you had to, as a landlord, pay for a roof repair, you can't not pay your contractor doing the roof repair. That still has to be done and paid and taken care of like normal.
Okay, and I got a last question too. So for commercial landlords, you say that they got the grace period till it really expires September, is that correct? And they got a grace period till March of 2021. So a landlord cannot do no kind of eviction if he did want to until March of 2021, correct?
Well, so how it works is for the time period from April until September. So if you're a commercial tenant and you don't pay any of the payments due, the rent, the utility, any of the other charges, from April to September, you have until the end of March to make those payments. And the landlord cannot evict you if you make those payments before the end of March of next year. The landlord also can't charge interest or late payment fees for any of those payments before the end of March of next year. Now, if you don't pay October, November, December rent, which is rent that's going to be due before March and is going to be due after the end of the commercial eviction moratorium, which was September 30th, then landlords can evict you for not making those payments. But again, as a landlord, if you get a payment from a tenant, you have to first apply it to payments that are due immediately before you apply it to payments that have been delayed due to the moratorium. So that if your tenant's payment keeps them current on their lease as much as possible until the grace period ends.
Can I, if I had a tenant and I did him this sort of a favor, like didn't have a contract with him, okay, and let him stay in there, but we had a verbal agreement to him paying me rent, okay, but now he don't pay me rent, you know, do this stuff apply to me as far as a contract go, even though we don't really have one in writing?
So it's gonna apply to anything that can be considered a month-to-month tenancy or a term tenancy. One of the issues that you might run into, depending on the terms, and I would talk to your attorney on this, someone who's actually familiar with the terms of what you're doing. There might be a statute of frauds issue where in certain real estate transactions require a writing to be valid. But if we're just talking about a month-to-month tenancy, that's still covered under the moratorium. That being said, I mean, I think one thing that I definitely advise my clients to do is, you know, all this stuff, get it in writing, even if it's not, you know, the cleanest, prettiest contract you've ever seen, even if it's just a statement of basically the rental terms that both of you sign at the bottom. Having it in writing helps for all contracts in various situations, not just this. And one thing you might do if you've got a tenant that's currently not paying is, as a landlord, you know, I mentioned that tenants should reach out to their landlords to discuss their inability to pay. You can also, as a landlord, reach out to your tenant to find out what's going on. You just want to make sure that you're not threatening the tenants with punishments that violate any ongoing moratoriums. But again, because we're outside the commercial eviction moratorium, most of those or a lot of those no longer apply, especially for currently due payments.
Yeah, I just don't want them to keep taking advantage of me. We don't have a contract. Where do my limit go to take possession of my property back? That's all I'm saying. Being that we don't have a contract on hand, what's my limitations to that? Because the person is just simply not paying.
If they're a commercial tenant and they aren't paying rent that was due after the moratorium ended, because the moratorium ended on September 30th, then you can take the normal procedures to evict them. They're no longer covered.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for your question. I think if there aren't any other questions from any of the participants, I think we can, wrap it up. And really, I appreciate your time, Bryson, and I appreciate everyone that tuned in for the first video of the series, the first session of the series. And so, where can people find where can people find all the information that we discussed?
So, like I said, if you provide your email address to the Soul District, Fawn Iverson, who is hosting it, she can email you my slideshow presentation that we went through, and as well as a copy of the orders, ordinances, and statutes that are in place. At any time, you can also feel free to email me extra questions. I'll put my email address back up on the screen. So you can email me here at bdavis@sussmanshank.com. Email me any questions that you have regarding eviction moratorium, foreclosure moratorium, or anything else you've got as far as your business is concerned.
Okay, great. And so again, I want to remind everybody that this is an educational series that will be happening every Monday at 10 a.m. And so I look forward to having another conversation on a different topic this time next week. And also, this series is also being recorded, and it will be available for review on the Soul District Business Association's website. And you can review this recording at www.souldistrictbiz.org. And so I thank you all for, I thank you, Bryson, for taking the time to share this valuable information with us. And really hope everyone saw this as a great opportunity to learn a little bit about, what's been going on outside of, all the things that we're sort of used to by now. And hopefully this will help you plan out the rest of your year and be a resource for you to navigate this tumultuous time that we're all dealing with. And so again, Bryson, I thank you for allowing us to, share just a little bit of the knowledge that you have. Again, I want to thank the Soul District Business Association and Flossa Media for hosting this event. Again, my name is Stephen Christian, your host for this series. And if there's any questions that you all have, again, go to www.souldistrictbiz.org for more information. And again, be safe, wear your mask, and let's get through this all together.
Thank you.
Yep. So thank you, Bryson, and we will be at the end of this. So thank you all, and I will see you all next week.
Thank you.